Is this where Jesus fed the 5,000? Maybe. We'll talk about that in just a moment. And then something else we're going to talk about today is briefly, what in the world is that and maybe why it's important. But that's just a number of the things that we want to discuss today in this edition of Land and the Book. And we're calling this particular segment today In His Steps because we want to walk in the steps of Jesus as we progress through the text that's found in John, the 6th chapter. So I hope you have your Bible, that you're ready to study today, and also that you have a map. BibleMapper.com is a great place to get some of the maps that we're going to utilize here today. Well, it's fascinating to think about some of the places associated with the ministry of Jesus, and I've had the blessing, and Carla has as well, to be able to walk in places like this, just outside of a little place called El Araj that we'll talk about in just a moment. Some put this, or at least near this location, as the site where Jesus fed the 5,000. Others put it a little bit further down south along the coast on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. Well, as we begin to study, let's remember the wonderful message of John and the gospel account regarding his message about building up our faith in Jesus and bringing us to a belief that he is in fact the Messiah, that he did a lot of signs. But these signs, John says, are recorded that we might believe. And so what are some of those signs? Well, some say that there are 8 signs recorded in the Gospel of John if you count the resurrection. And then others say, no, there's 7 times when he actually uses that word sign. And in particular today, we're going to notice that this is the 4th sign in the progression of the text that has to do with the feeding of these 5,000. Now, that's a very interesting and important evidence associated with Jesus being a true prophet of God, because true prophets of God in Old Testament history were those who miraculously fed people in the wilderness, like Moses as a prophet did in feeding of the manna to the children of Israel, or whether it was Elijah or Elisha. And we know the connection that the Scripture makes in the New Testament about people saying that Jesus has indeed come in the spirit of these men. So let's talk, though, today then about that 4th sign, because in order to believe that that 4th sign really occurred, we have to ask the question, did it take place in a real geographic location, just like the Bible describes? If I'm going to believe in the miracle and the sign that John reveals, he gives us a lot of historical and geographical data associated with that sign that says, okay, he knew what he was talking about. He was there. He identified these places, or could write about them from the witnesses and the accounts that were given him to suggest, you know what, there's a reason to believe this, because these are real people in a real time and a real place. So let's talk about this geographical setting and the context. And as we do, we really want to do 3 things today. We want to particularly start off by talking about the general location, but we're also going to describe the geopolitical context, and then spend some time looking at a map associated with the cities and the sites around the Sea of Galilee. So let's first acquaint ourselves with the physical features as we talk about the general area in which this miracle took place. As we do, remember that the Bible lands can be, in a very general way, be divided up into 4 or 5 longitudinal zones: the coastal plain, then there is the central mountain range, then there is the Jordan Valley. It's a part of the Rift Valley that goes all the way down into the continent of Africa. But this depression then, and that's where the Sea of Galilee is located, in this Rift Valley, and then the Transjordan Mountains, and then what you can't see on this map is the Eastern Desert. So 5 major zones as an easy way to think about the sort of physical features associated with the Bible lands. But it is much more technical than that. And in other or subsequent lessons, we will talk about these particular sub-regions, as I like to call them, but really they're just geographic zones that would include places like the biblical Negev, which is a basin that's wedged between the the uplifts in the south and the mountain ranges to the north. Places like Beersheba are there, or this little region known as the Sphala, or the foothills, the humble foothills between the coastal plain and the central mountain range. And then you've got places like the Jezreel Valley, the Mount Carmel Range, and then Lower Galilee, Upper Galilee, and then this region known as the Sea of Galilee. Now notice that this sea is actually a depression, a geographic depression. It's actually well below sea level. And so as a result of that, some unique events as far as climate are concerned, or the weather, can often occur there as the winds make their way off of these higher elevations, then quickly come down on the Sea of Galilee. In fact, one of the things that can occur is not only the eastern wind or the western wind off of the Mediterranean Sea, but winds that might then just come down quickly off of Mount Hermon and come down into that narrow valley and then sort of burst out onto the Sea of Galilee, creating a storm, sometimes just rather quickly, and with the feeling as though they sort of came out of nowhere. Here's a particular photograph from that's taken on the eastern side at a place called Gamla, and just near that area you can see off in the distance now the Sea of Galilee, and then these hills that I've been talking about that are surrounding it. And then you go to the other side of the Sea of Galilee on the western side, and from Mount Arbel you can see Gamla off in the distance where that last photograph was taken, and literally this sort of coliseum of hills that is surrounding the Sea of Galilee. You come a little further to the edge of Mount Arbel on that westernmost extreme of the Sea of Galilee, and you can see the plains of Gennesaret, and you definitely get that feeling of this sort of bowl-like feature with mountains around it, and this depression of the Sea of Galilee where the water has gathered, forming a lake. So that's in a very general sense of where these events in the ministry of Jesus in Galilee took place. So the word Galilee has reference to a physical features type of term relative to geography, but then also it has a geopolitical connection. And at the time of Jesus, you might remember that King Herod, after he died, that his large, massive kingdom was divided by the Romans, and that there was made by this area of Idumea, Samaria, and Judea, it became an imperial province ruled by a Roman prefect, and Pontius Pilate was one of those at the time of Jesus that was ruling this area. But the rest of Herod's kingdom was divided among his sons, and this map really shows you then those particular areas. So when you read in your Bible places like here in the Decapolis area, or maybe the places associated with King Antipas, like Perea, and like here in Perea down here to the south, that belonged to Antipas, or maybe Caesarea Philippi that was a part of this particular region here. That's where that terminology, or that's what that terminology is referring to, that his kingdom was divided up among his sons. And then this area right here, by the way, are the 10 cities that were sort of independent cities, mostly, almost all of them except Scythopolis, on the eastern side of the Jordan River. Now, what's interesting about that is that the Sea of Galilee is right smack dab in the middle of three of those regions. And so you can see here this area that belonged to Antipas and his rule, and then a little further northeast here to Philip, and then this area of the Decapolis that it comes on up around here that we refer to sometimes as the Gadarenes. And remember the story of the demonic man, the man possessed of the demons, where Jesus cast those demons out into the herd of swine. That took place right over here. And so knowing a little bit about that, I think, helps us to appreciate some of the encounters that Jesus had with Gentile people, and why there would be people even herding swine over here, because these were Roman cities over here in this region of the Decapolis. All right, so that's a general sort of overview of where the Sea of Galilee is, and then the geopolitical regions associated with that area. But let's talk about now the Sea of Galilee itself. What are some unique features associated with it that might be of interest to us in this Land and Book series? Well, as we look at this marvelous setting and this beautiful lake, let's note a few things. First of all, it is called a sea, and sometimes people wonder, well, does that mean that it is heavily, that it has a heavy salt content associated with it? Well, there's salt, to be sure, in it, just like there is generally in any amount of water anywhere, but it is fresh water. It's not salt water in that sense, it's fresh water. Well, then why is it called a sea? Well, in the Hebrew language, there was only one word to refer to large bodies of water. And so whether it was this, thinking about maybe some of the desert places that they had visited, to see something like this, it was large. It was a massive amount of water, and they didn't necessarily make a distinction between that and maybe the Red Sea or the Mediterranean Sea. They hadn't traveled very far, many of them, and so to them, a large body of water they just had one Hebrew word associated with it. Well, Greek had two words associated with large bodies of water, one referring to salt water, one referring to fresh water like this, and but still, even then, the Greek writers in the New Testament used a word referring to a sea, maybe sort of keeping that Hebrew heritage alive and connecting it to the past in some way. So it's just a geographic term in a general sense to refer to a large body of water. Now, the size of it, 13 by 7.5 miles wide, and some say, well, what particular area does that connect us to in terms of the size of something? I think it's roughly about 1/3 of the size or 2/3 the size of Lake Tahoe, to give you some perspective on that. 64 square miles, and Washington D.C. 68 square miles. So think about that size, not very big. Sea of Galilee itself, not very big. The depth of it, 33 miles of shoreline, the depth of it 144 to 157 feet, depending upon the amount of rain that has come in any given year. The Sea of Galilee today, just like in the past, recedes. It goes up and down. Now today it's controlled a little better because of a dam at the southern end. But so keep that in mind as I mention something a little bit later on about this place called El Araj, which some people think is the biblical town of Bethsaida. All right, then it's 1,280 feet below the surrounding hills, but notice 690 feet below sea level. So even though some of these surrounding hills on a map, in terms of elevation, may not seem that high, when you factor in that it's 690 feet below sea level, then this perspective on top of Mount Arbel looking down on the sea does definitely give you then a large amount of distance from the top of these mountains down to the sea below. Now, as far as the names of the sea, in the Old Testament, sometimes it was called Kinneret, and some make a connection between that and a Hebrew word that sounds a little bit like a lyre, the instrument. And so because maybe the Sea of Galilee looks a little bit like this, if you look at it carefully, it looks a little bit like maybe that musical instrument of a lyre. And because the Hebrew word that's connected to that sounds a little bit like Kinneret, that some say that that's then why it got its name. Others say, no, there is a town here named Kinneret, and that's why it got that. The New Testament refers to it sometimes as the Sea of Galilee, and the word Galilee just refers to a region. So this region north of the main heartland of the territory of Judah and Samaria. And then sometimes it's referred to as just the sea in the New Testament. And then, like in our text in John chapter 6, verse 1, it's referred to not only as the Sea of Galilee, but also John makes us realize that it's called Tiberias. And Tiberias is a town that actually developed during one of the reigns of the emperors that was actually created this town, and the local officials gave it this name, Tiberias, in honor of that emperor who was ruling at the time of Jesus, and so the lake then becomes known as that. Of course, Tiberius was a ruthless emperor in a lot of ways, and it just sort of boggles my mind that some were referring to that particular lake as Tiberias. Okay, so what about the distance to nearby locations, just to give us some perspective in terms of Jesus' movement from place to place? Well, from Nazareth to Capernaum is about a 40-mile walk, maybe 2 to 5 day journey, or 2 to 4 days. From Cana, it's about 35 miles. This is the so-called Jesus Trail that people can walk today. And if they divide it up into about 4 days, although Jesus could have walked it much quicker than that, and probably did. So roughly a day and a half, maybe 2 days, it would have taken him to go from Nazareth over to Cana and then back around to Capernaum. Others say that he dropped down into the Jezreel Valley, went around Mount Tabor, and then up here around the Horns of Hattim, coming out right near Magdala, the plains of Gennesaret, just below Mount Arbel that I was describing a moment ago, and then walking along the western shore, getting up here to this city that Matthew tells us Jesus made his home and that he operated from in his public ministry here in Galilee. And then from Capernaum to Cana, which is an area that we're going to look at here in just a moment that I think is associated with the feeding of the 5,000. It's roughly 4 miles across there. So somewhere right around here is Cana, so roughly 4 miles across here. And if you'll remember, in reading John chapter 6, there is a particular reference to that in verse number 19, that the disciples, when they'd gotten out in the boat, had actually gone out about 3 or 4 miles. Now, just a couple of things associated with John chapter 6 that we want to remember, and that is that Jesus, according to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, tells us that this event happened right after the death of John the Baptizer. And Jesus wanted to get away, and he goes out to a deserted place, and when he's out in this deserted place, these people find him. And when he does, he's gone up on the mountain. Still some things we're not quite sure about the exact order of things, and trying to put all that together in the gospel accounts. But we know that they follow him, and they're out of ways a little bit from a town, and Jesus then commands that they be fed, and where they're going to get food, Jesus asks, and they Jesus performs this miracle. And as one of the signs, 5,000 are fed. And then remember that they get back, the disciples go down to the seashore, the 12, and they get into a boat, but Jesus returns to a mountain. And then the disciples go to head across to Capernaum, and while they're out there, then this strong wind blows, and they're not able to get control of the ship, and Jesus comes walking to them on the water. They end up back at Capernaum, and that's where the crowd then comes back to. They find him, they get into other ships, and they come across to Capernaum, and they find him there, and they're sort of scratching their heads wondering, well, how did you get here? And then Jesus then has this great discourse here on being the bread of life, and reminding them that, you didn't seek me because of what the miracles meant, but because you did eat of the fish and the loaves and were fed. And then after they hear this message about what it really means to be a disciple, that many of them walk no more with him, and he turns to the 12 and he said, will you also go away? And of course Peter makes that great confession, or that great utterance about, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life, and we believe and know that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Okay? So in a very generic sense then, that's sort of the story, summarizing it, some of the places. Let's now identify and look at some photographs associated with certain cities and sites connected to John chapter 6 and other places in the gospel accounts. So if you've got this map from Bible Mapper, you'll notice that starting right over here near Magdala, there is this what seems to be a large hill, and it is a large mountain that is known as Arbel, and that then further south here, there is a place called Tiberias. And here is today from a hotel that we stayed in, looking out over the city of Tiberias, and you can see then looking south down the Sea of Galilee to give you some idea of the beauty of this place and the mountains that surrounded it. So this is the area of Tiberias. And then another place we want to notice is over here at Magdala, where a particular village that we'll look at in a moment was discovered. But right now I want you to see Mount Arbel and how from Nazareth, Jesus and his disciples would have come right down this little pathway in this narrow valley and then would have made their way out onto the plains of Gennesaret and then made their way on around to Capernaum a little further north. Well, up to the right here is then this anticline or this geologic formation here that from a distance becomes a very prominent feature in that location and in that region. And I wonder sometimes, is this a mountain that Jesus would go to? Because we like to take groups and to go up here and to look out over the Sea of Galilee. And you can see the Sea of Galilee right here on the edge and right near the city or the village or the town of Magdala. Here's a good panoramic view of this area and that little area that Jesus and his disciples, this is a branch of the International Coastal Highway that again came along the way of the sea, came along the Sea of Galilee, and then went on up into the area of Mesopotamia. And this particular photograph now shows you that the plains of Gennesaret from that mountain I was just describing to you, Mount Arbel. Interestingly enough, and I'll go back here in just a moment, I think there's a pretty powerful lesson here because Mount Arbel is never mentioned in the New Testament. And while though it is never mentioned there, it is all so obvious that it exists. And sometimes we make the point, there's a great spiritual lesson there, that sometimes people don't get their names mentioned somewhere, but their presence is also obvious, right? That if they weren't there in a particular congregation or in a particular family, they would certainly be missed. But even though their name isn't mentioned, even maybe they're not always out front and, in a sort of notarized or in a very notorious or well-known situation or person, their influence is felt and it's seen. And sometimes we make that connection up there on Mount Arbel, okay? So as we make our way a little further around, I want you to notice something right here on this map called the Cove of the Sower. Notice along the coastline here that there are little indentations or little recesses in the coastal area or the shoreline. And this particular area looks like this, where you have sort of a little natural cove here where fishermen could have brought their boats and mended their nets to sort of get out away from the wind as it blew across the Sea of Galilee to give them some protection. And though this photograph doesn't do a good job of really presenting it as well as it existed the first time that I was there some 20 or more years ago, but this one does a little bit better. But there's a natural sort of amphitheater right here. And here is the cove that I was just describing. And it's called the Cove of the Sower because you remember Jesus was preaching to a number of people, preaching about the parable of the sower, and there's so many people pressing him along that shore while the disciples were mending their nets that he had to get into a boat and push back just away from the shoreline so that he could preach. Well, this would make a natural place for an amphitheater, or wasn't a natural amphitheater for large crowds to gather so that they could easily hear. And when I was there on one occasion many years ago, we actually set up, and there's a banana plantation here now, but then there was a large rock over here, and you could sit on a large rock, and then someone could stand down here about 100 yards away and just read out of their Bible, and you could easily hear what the person was saying down here on the shoreline. So as a result of that sort of natural amphitheater and this little cove where it had been a great place for fishermen to gather to mend their nets, it then by tradition became known as the Cove of the Sower. Well, out on the sea, off in the distance here, you can begin to see where Capernaum is located, and that's our next stop here. We've gone from Tiberias to Magdala and the area here where Mount Arbel is located. We went up here to the Cove of the Sower. Now we're coming to Capernaum, where that was the administrative district of the area, and where a number of important functions locally took place, including a synagogue and the worship that took place there. And here's the remains of this city on the northwest. Look at the Sea of Galilee off in the distance here. So many of the things that you read in the New Testament about, whether it is Peter going down and getting a coin out of the fish's mouth to pay the tax, or whether it is Jesus walking on the water, or the feeding of the 5,000 as they get in this boat and go across, you get a perspective by looking at these photographs that, okay, this is all in a fairly close proximity, and these are real places. And just over to the side here is a church building built over the top of what many people believe to be the house of Peter's mother-in-law. And that's another discussion for another time. But here is the shoreline down at Capernaum, then looking across over to where I believe this miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 took place. In Capernaum, there is the remains of a synagogue. This one dates to the 4th or 5th century AD from the Byzantine period. But notice that it is resting on the top of an older foundation made of basalt rock, this volcanic rock. This is imported stone that has been brought here. But evidently there was an older synagogue here where, as you, in reading through the gospel accounts, remember that Jesus in his public ministry came and healed a man's hand that had been withered here, and where, as we saw in reading or referred to in John chapter 6, where then they met up with Jesus and he spoke to them about being the bread of life. So those events that you're reading in John chapter 6 right now took place in a setting like this, in a location that Jesus had to have been at right here. This is it. This is an obvious thing to think about. Well, one little side note here is that archaeologists found at Capernaum a number of these grinding stones, and different ones and different types. Maybe it was a place where you could come and buy one for your particular community and take it back there. Or this may have been a central location. As we said, it's an administrative center where people from the area brought their grain and would have it ground up. And so think about that image of that grinding stone and what Jesus said in Luke chapter 17 about sin coming to us. He said, sin is going to come, but woe to that person through whom it comes. It's better that a millstone be tied about their neck and then them cast into the depths of the sea. What did we say? Sometimes 144 feet deep or deeper out there. And for this millstone to be tied about your neck and cast into the depths of the sea. That's a powerful image that Jesus is utilizing, that the people of that era would have really readily understood and appreciated, because wow, a millstone? What a horrifying death. It was something that Jesus used to teach to us, to those people and all of us today, about the seriousness of sin. That we commit sin, it's a bad thing, but if we call someone else to sin, it's a terrible thing. And so it puts things in perspective. So those are some of the sites and the locations associated with what we're talking about here in the ministry of Jesus, and in particular on this eastern side where Jesus meets the demonic man and he casts out the demons into the herd of swine. They run into a steep place down in the Sea of Galilee, or what I believe to be the general area of the feeding of the 5,000 as described in this text. So the question then becomes, as we move then to our third and final point for this session, is where did that sign take place? Where did that miracle take place, this fourth sign? Well, in going back through the text, there are a number of clues that we want to notice that might help us just from John. And then we read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and we can get some further indicators as well. So verse number 1, we read that they went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Well, the question that we need to consider is, well, where did it start? If they went to the other side, were they on the east side and then went to the west side, or were they on the west side and went to the east side? Interestingly enough, there's nothing in there that tells us in the Bible about where they were when they headed across, at least nothing that I remember. We do find out that they went back across and ended up at Capernaum, so by then deduction, we have to know that they're on the western side. So they were on the western side. Jesus went up on the mountain. So they got over to this area, went up on the mountain, or he did. So there has to be a mountain maybe, fairly nearby. And something else that's of interest, though not maybe as important in terms of identifying it, but the Passover was at hand. And that would have taken place roughly to our time of year of March, April. And we've been there a lot of times during the March-April period, and it's green, usually especially in March, very beautiful in areas. So a nice, comfortable sort of setting to be in, to sit down. The temperature would have been better than to go out and people be alone, 5,000 of them in August or in July. We've been there during that time, and it's just brutal down in the Sea of Galilee, down low. So again, another little interesting connection as far as what the Bible says, the time of year. Okay, that makes sense. 5,000 people sort of going out into a so-called deserted or desert place, which doesn't mean that it was sand. It just means that it was away from the city. It was out in an uninhabited area, but still would have been quite, I think, comfortable in many ways. In fact, verse 10 says there was much grass in that place. So there's another little clue for us. Verse 15 says that then Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. So evidently he'd gone up on the mountain and then maybe he'd come back down. He saw the crowds coming toward him at some point, went back down. It's a little hard to kind of put all this together, but it's still a clue. When evening came, his disciples then went down to the sea. So how far away were they from the sea where the miracle took place? We don't know exactly, but they weren't right on the shoreline. They weren't up in the mountain. There seems to be maybe somewhere in between then. And then verse 17 says they got into a boat. They started across to Capernaum. Well, how far is across, and where do you have to be to go across? You could be on that far northern end. It could only be 3 or 4 miles, but it's still across. Or it could be further south and go that 13 miles across. So is across 13 miles or 3 to 4 miles? The Bible doesn't really tell us. We just know that he went across, okay, instead of walking around by the shoreline. Verse 19, they rode 3 to 4 miles out into that sea, and they were struggling, and that's when they saw Jesus walking on the water. So some 3 to 4 miles out there. And then we read later on that on the next day that boats from Tiberias had come up. So you can actually, as you're going to see in just a moment, stand in an area where I think basically the feeding of the 5,000 could have occurred, and you can look across and see Tiberias. Now, seeing it at that distance, making out 1 or 2 people, no, but if you see 5,000 people, you would have said, hey, something's going on over there, and maybe those people need a ride. They're off kind of in a place by themselves, and so boats go over there. They're curious what's happening. Maybe they've heard about Jesus. And so they come from Tiberias, which is a lot further than 3 or 4 miles, probably more like 10 or 12 over to this area, 7 or 8, something like that. And they go all the way over there to this crowd, and then they take boats and go back across to Capernaum. And they're surprised to see Jesus because they had seen the disciples get in the boat and go across, and now Jesus is there. All right. Then in verse 24 and also in verse 59, we read that they got into the boats and they went to Capernaum, and that was then they were in the synagogue, verse 59 says where Jesus was preaching to them about the bread of life. So we know the ending point. So the beginning point was at Capernaum, probably. That's where Jesus made his home. And so then where then did the feeding of the 5,000 take place? Well, I was just taking some notes on this and looking at all the different accounts associated with this. It's interesting that the context associated with this story, 3 of them follow the death of John the Baptizer. Maybe that troubled Jesus in a lot of ways, as we can just imagine it would, thinking about his cousin, his friend, being murdered in that way, executed, and how that must have affected him. And he just needed to get away by himself. And so let's get in a boat, get away from people that can't follow me as easily that way, and I'll go over to the other side. Now, where on the other side? Well, if you read in Luke's account, you read that he took them, his disciples, and drew apart to a town called Bethsaida. And then when the crowds heard, they followed him over there. And maybe he sees them following him and walking around maybe the northern end or something, and he decides, I'm going to go up into the mountain to get away and to pray. But at some point then, he's going to encounter them. Now, where is Bethsaida on a map? Interestingly enough, there are 2 competing locations for this. This one, known as Et-Tel, and they didn't have a sign. They didn't find a sign at this particular tell or this archaeological site where there was evidence of civilization and people living there and houses and buildings and walls. They found a pretty significant site up here at a place called Et-Tel, and for many years, people believed that to be Bethsaida. But it's kind of far away from the coastal line. So is that the town of a fisherman or a fisherman? And they did find some things up there associated with fishing, not very much, but some. And but thought, well, maybe is that the town? But then in recent years, the last 10, 15 years, discoveries have been made here at a place called El Araj of a civilization, a smaller civilization that was there that dates back to the time of Christ. First, a Byzantine church building, 4th, 5th century AD was found there. And in fact, there it is right there on the map, El Araj, located there. Notice the Jordan River comes right down here by that site. And still, well, it's a little further away, but how far away? Well, this will give you a perspective right here. By the way, I think that this may be the place where the feeding of the 5,000 took place in that area at a place called Kanar. But what about El Araj? This is a little older picture of that excavation site here that I took with my little drone. And notice the Jordan River comes right here, and there is the mouth of it. But I went back at another time, and it was muddy everywhere. The waters of the Sea of Galilee had come all the way up and actually flooded this area. So the shoreline had actually come right up to this location. And so maybe this is Bethsaida. All right, well, we don't know, and that's, again, another discussion, a long discussion, debate between those 2 sites, but we do believe and are confident that it was on this northeastern side right here near the Jordan River as it comes in to the Sea of Galilee. And here's another photograph of that area. But then I want you to notice that just around the corner here, where the water has been coming up in here and flooding up in here recently, but around the corner, it sort of widens out into a plain. And just a little bit then north of that, here is a photograph of that plain. Okay, and then you can see some mountains off in the distance. And here is another area. Now, this picture is taken much later in the summer. Things are already much browner. But you can see some mountains here. And then this area, this plain, the plains of Bethsaida, right here, that could be near the site where Jesus fed the 5,000. Smaller village maybe there at Bethsaida. He's going up into one of these mountains here. Large crowds are following him. Or was it a little further on around? Now, you see these trees over here? That's where El Araj is located. That tell where some say Bethsaida is. you keep coming around, here is this little modern kibbutz, little town known as Kanar. And there is a hotel here, and we've stayed in this little hotel and walked down to the beach on the shoreline here, and look, you can see all the way across, way over there to Tiberias. Capernaum is somewhere over in here. So just imagine that the disciples getting in the boat, going across, a little quicker in their mind than to have to walk all the way back around the sea to get over to Capernaum. But they get in the boat, go across. Jesus goes back up to the mountain. Well, is there a mountain back behind this? Yes, there is. Just above, on the eastern side of Kanar there, here is the highway that you traveled north to south along that shoreline. Just up from the shoreline, you can see a mountain. So a large one up here. Is this the mountain? Well, we can't say that this is the one. The point is that I can just see Jesus going up into one of these mountains like this from Gamala that I mentioned to you earlier. You can see the Sea of Galilee. So maybe up here, a great place for Jesus to gain perspective, to get away, and to think about what all had happened, to draw strength from God, sends his disciples down in that boat, and then he comes walking to them on that water, and they end up at Capernaum. So this is the setting. These are some of the locations associated with this fourth sign, the feeding of the multitude. I don't know if that's it for sure, but it's in that area, and maybe this will give you a perspective of the geographic location and the sites associated with the Bible lands, to know that as we study the land in the book, we can walk in the steps of Jesus.